What if I told you that every single US state has a secret it would rather forget? Not the kind of secret that makes for good dinner conversation, but the kind that gets quietly edited out of history textbooks and conveniently left off the tourist brochures. Tonight, we're taking a slow, quiet tour across America, stopping in all 50 states to uncover the stories that got buried, the events that got sanitized, and the truths that took decades, sometimes centuries, to acknowledge. Some of these stories are strange, some are tragic, and all of them are completely verifiably true. So get comfortable, settle in, and maybe grab an extra pillow because we're about to spend the next couple hours drifting through the darker corners of American history. Let's begin. Alabama, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Picture this, if you will, a small county in Alabama, 1932. The Great Depression is weighing heavy on everyone, but especially on the sharecroppers and farmers trying to scrape by in Macon County. Now imagine someone from the government shows up and tells you they're going to give you free medical care, free meals, a little cash for your time. All you have to do is participate in a study about bad blood. Sounds reasonable, right? Except here's the thing nobody told those 399 men. They had syphilis. And the doctors running the study had absolutely no intention of curing them. For 40 years, let that sink in for a moment. 40 years, these men were observed, poked, prodded, and studied while their bodies slowly deteriorated. Even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s and could have cured them completely, the treatment was deliberately withheld. Men went blind, organs failed, some died. And because nobody bothered to tell them what they actually had, they unknowingly passed the disease to their wives and children. The study didn't end because someone in charge suddenly grew a conscience. It ended in 1972 because a whistleblower leaked the story to the press, and the public was, understandably, horrified. By then, dozens of men had died, and countless families had been shattered. The government eventually apologized, decades later, but apologies don't unblind eyes or bring back the dead. It's one of those things that makes you wonder how many people had to sign off on this, year after year, and somehow convince themselves it was acceptable. But of course, that wasn't the only time the government made decisions that seem incomprehensible in hindsight. Alaska, the Aleutian internment. Speaking of government decisions that aged like milk in the sun, let's drift north to Alaska during World War II. When Japan invaded a couple of islands in the Aleutian chain in 1942, the US military decided the Aleut people, who'd lived on those islands for thousands of years, needed to be relocated for their own safety. Noble enough in theory, except the execution was about as thoughtful as using a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame. 881 Aleut people were rounded up and shipped to abandoned canneries and old mining camps in southeast Alaska. These weren't exactly luxury accommodations. We're talking buildings with no insulation, no running water, no medical facilities. The kind of places you wouldn't even store fishing equipment, let alone house entire communities. The conditions were so bad that over 10% of the relocated Aleuts died from disease and, malnutrition during their internment. Meanwhile, back on their now empty islands, US soldiers looted their homes and churches, taking personal belongings, sacred items, anything that wasn't nailed down. Some homes were deliberately burned. When the Aleuts were finally allowed to return after the war, many found their villages destroyed and their possessions gone. The government offered a half-hearted apology and some compensation decades later, but it's hard to square "we relocated you for your protection" with "and then we stole everything you owned while you were dying in an abandoned fish cannery." But let's keep moving west, because the stories only get stranger from here. Arizona, the long walk of the Navajo. Now, if you thought forced relocations couldn't get worse, Let me introduce you to Kit Carson and the Long Walk of the Navajo. In 1864, Carson, who'd made a name for himself as a frontier scout, was given orders to subdue the Navajo people in what's now Arizona and New Mexico. His strategy was what you might call scorched earth, though that phrase somehow makes it sound more strategic than it was. Carson's forces systematically burned Navajo crops, chopped down their peach orchards, and slaughtered their livestock. Thousands of sheep and goats just killed and left to rot. The idea was to starve the Navajo into submission, and unfortunately, it worked. Over 8,000 Navajo people were forced to march 300 miles to a desolate reservation at Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. They called it the Long Walk, which feels like calling the Titanic's voyage a bit damp. At least 200 people died during the march itself, from exhaustion, starvation, exposure. The very young and very old suffered the most. And Bosque Redondo? Absolute nightmare. The land was barren, the water was brackish, and made people sick, and there wasn't nearly enough food. People died from disease and malnutrition. The government had promised supplies that never arrived. 4 years later, even the US government had to admit this was a catastrophic failure, and the Navajo were allowed to return to a fraction of their original homeland. It remains one of the darkest chapters in the long, grim history of US Native relations. And unfortunately, it's far from the only massacre we'll encounter on this quiet tour. Arkansas, the Elaine Massacre of 1919. Let's drift east to Arkansas in 1919, right after World War I. Black sharecroppers in Phillips County had a reasonable request. They wanted to be paid fairly for their cotton. Revolutionary stuff, right? They formed a union called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America and started meeting to discuss how to negotiate better prices. On the night of September 30th, gunfire broke out at a church where union members were meeting. What happened next depends on who you ask. But here's what we know for certain. White mobs, aided by federal troops, spent the next 3 days killing black residents throughout the county. The official death toll was listed as 5 white people and 25 black people, but historians who've actually looked into it estimate between 100 and 240 black citizens were killed. Bodies were thrown into the Mississippi River. Some were left in unmarked graves. 12 black men were quickly convicted of murder and sentenced to death, based largely on confessions obtained through torture. The Supreme Court eventually overturned those convictions in a landmark case, but not before the men spent years on death row. The white people who participated in the massacre, not a single one was prosecuted. The whole thing was officially labeled a race riot for decades, as if both sides were equally responsible, which is a bit like calling a tiger attack a disagreement between species. But speaking of places where the official narrative took a while to catch up with reality, California, the California genocide. Here's a cheerful topic, genocide. And before you think, surely that's hyperbole, the state of California itself now uses that word to describe what happened to Native Americans after the gold rush. When gold was discovered in 1848, the population of California exploded. And by exploded, I mean hundreds of thousands of people showed up looking to get rich, and Native Americans were very much in the way. Governor Peter Burnett wasn't subtle about his intentions. In 1851, he declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Just put that right in an official government message. The state government funded militias and vigilante groups to hunt Native people. There were bounties. You could get paid for scalps and body parts. Between 1846 and 1873, an estimated 16,000 Native Californians were killed outright, and tens of thousands more died from disease, starvation, and forced displacement. Entire tribes were wiped out. The population of native Californians dropped from around 300,000 to around 30,000 in just a few decades. The state government was so thorough in its destruction that many tribes simply ceased to exist. California formally apologized for this in 2019, which is better than nothing, but it's hard not to notice it took them 150 years to get around to it. And somehow, this wasn't even the only massacre that happened in 1864. Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre. Speaking of 1864, let's head to Colorado. The Civil War is raging back east, but out west, tensions between settlers and native tribes are reaching a boiling point. Colonel John Chivington, a Methodist minister turned military commander, decided to make a name for himself. On November 29th, he led 700 U.S. soldiers in an attack on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village at Sand Creek. The village was flying both an American flag and a white flag of truce. Didn't matter. Chivington's orders, by multiple accounts, aimed were to kill and scalp all, big and little. Over 150 people were killed, most of them women, children, and elderly men. The warriors were away hunting. Soldiers mutilated bodies in ways I won't describe here because we're trying to help you sleep, not give you nightmares. Body parts were taken as trophies and displayed in Denver. One soldier later testified that he saw a woman killed while begging for mercy. A 3-year-old child shot at close range. It was so grotesque that even by 1860 standards, there was outrage. Congress held hearings. Witnesses testified. And then basically nothing happened to Chivington. He resigned his commission to avoid court-martial and lived out his days as a free man. The massacre is now recognized as one of the most shameful episodes in American military history, which is saying something. But let's head back east for a moment to a place known for its charming colonial history. Connecticut, the Charter Oak and hidden tyranny. Connecticut loves to tell the story of the Charter Oak, that legendary tree where colonists supposedly hid their royal charter in 1687 to protect it from the British governor. It's a nice story about freedom and defiance. What Connecticut is less enthusiastic about discussing is that while they were busy protecting their charter and their liberties, they were also holding people in slavery until 1848, making them one of the very last northern states to end the practice. At its peak in the late 1700s, Connecticut had more enslaved people per capita than any other New England state. We're talking thousands of people held in bondage in the land of steady habits. The state's economy was deeply tied to the slave trade. Connecticut ships transported enslaved Africans, Connecticut merchants profited from the triangle trade, and wealthy Connecticut families built their fortunes on the backs of unpaid labor. Even after gradual emancipation began in 1797, the process was so slow that people born into slavery before that date could be held until age 25. So you could have someone born in 1796 who wasn't legally free until 1821. The last enslaved person in Connecticut wasn't freed until 1848, which is somehow the same year the Mexican-American War ended and gold was discovered in California. Let that timeline sink in. While the rest of the country was expanding westward and fighting about whether new states would be slave or free, Connecticut was still dragging its feet on the whole freeing people thing. But at least they eventually got there, unlike some states that decided to double down on creative forms of punishment. Delaware, the whipping post. Delaware, that tiny state you drive through on your way to somewhere else, has the distinction of being the last state in America to use public whipping as criminal punishment. Not 1865, not 1905, but 1952. Eisenhower was president. I Love Lucy was on television. And Delaware was still tying people to a post and whipping them in public. The whipping post at the new Castle County Courthouse was used for over 200 years, which is longer than the United States has existed. The last public whipping occurred in June of 1952, and the offense was wife beating. which creates this weird moral paradox where you're punishing violence with state sanctioned violence in front of a crowd. Delaware finally abolished whipping later that year, not because they suddenly realized it was barbaric, but because it had become a public relations nightmare. Newspapers around the country were writing articles about how Delaware was stuck in the medieval era. It's one of those things where you can imagine the state government saying, okay, fine, we'll stop, but only because you're all being really annoying about it. The whipping post itself stayed up at the courthouse until 1953, almost like they were keeping it around just in case they changed their minds. You can still see the original post today in a museum, which is arguably where it belonged all along. But while Delaware was slowly catching up to the 20th century, down in Florida, an entire town was being erased. Florida, the Rosewood Massacre. In early January of 1923, a predominantly black town called Rosewood in Levy County, Florida, was thriving. It had churches, a school, a Masonic hall, a baseball team. About 300 people lived there. By January 7th, the town no longer existed. What happened in between is one of the most complete destructions of a community in American history. It started with a lie. A white woman in a nearby town claimed she'd been attacked by a black man. No evidence, just an accusation. But that was enough. White mobs from surrounding areas descended on Rosewood. Over 6 days, they killed at least 6 black residents, though some estimates put the number in the dozens. Homes were burned, churches were destroyed. Survivors fled into the swamps and nearby forests, hiding in the cold January weather while armed men hunted them. Some were sheltered by sympathetic white residents who hid them in their homes or helped them escape on trains. By the time it was over, Rosewood was gone, just burned foundations and empty land. The town was never rebuilt. For decades, it was barely mentioned, like it had been erased from history along with the buildings. The survivors scattered across the South and carried the trauma with them. It wasn't until 1994 that Florida formally acknowledged the massacre and offered compensation to survivors, though by then most had died. You can visit the site today, but there's almost nothing left except some historical markers. It's strange to stand in a place where a whole community once existed and see only trees. Georgia, the convict lease system. After the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Georgia and other southern states had to get creative about maintaining free labor, and boy, did they get creative. Enter the convict lease system, which was somehow worse than slavery in some ways. Here's how it worked. The state would arrest black men on minor charges: vagrancy, loitering, not having a job, basically existing while black. Then lease them out to private companies to work in coal mines, turpentine camps, lumber operations, whatever needed bodies. The companies paid the state for the labor, and the prisoners got nothing except brutal conditions and an early grave. Death rates in some camps reached 30 to 45%. Higher than slavery because at least enslaved people were considered property worth keeping alive. Least convicts, they were expendable. If one died, the state would just arrest someone else. The companies had zero incentive to keep anyone healthy or safe. Men worked in mines without ventilation, got beaten for working too slowly, and slept in cramped, filthy barracks. They were literally worked to death, and the system was entirely legal. Georgia's convict lease system lasted until 1908, though similar systems persisted in other states for years after. When it finally ended, it wasn't because of moral outrage, but because it had become economically inefficient and politically embarrassing. Thousands of men died in those camps, most in unmarked graves, their names lost to history. It's a reminder that the end of slavery didn't mean the end of forced labor. It just meant people had to be more creative about it. And speaking of erasure, let's travel west to a place where an entire kingdom disappeared, almost overnight. 10 states down, 40 to go. The hour is growing late, and the history is only getting heavier. If your eyes are starting to drift shut, let them. These stories will be here in the morning, though some of them waited over a century to be told, so a few hours won't hurt. Let's keep drifting. Hawaii, the overthrow of the kingdom. In 1893, Hawaii had a queen, a functioning government, and a sovereignty that had been recognized by nations around the world for decades. By the end of that year, it had none of those things, and the story of how that happened is one of the stranger tales of American expansion. Queen Liliuokalani had ascended to the throne in 1891 and was trying to restore power to the Hawaiian monarchy and native Hawaiian people. American sugar planters who'd grown wealthy in Hawaii weren't particularly thrilled about this, especially since it might mean they'd actually have to pay taxes or follow regulations. So they did what any reasonable businessmen would do. They called in the Marines, literally. In January of 1893, a group of American and European sugar barons, Taos are backed by U.S. Marines from the USS Boston, who just happened to be conveniently anchored in Honolulu Harbor, staged a coup. They declared the monarchy dissolved and set up their own provisional government. Queen Liliuokalani, facing armed troops and wanting to avoid bloodshed, yielded her authority under protest, trusting that the U.S. government would investigate and restore her throne. President Grover Cleveland actually did investigate, and he was not happy about what he found. He called the overthrow an act of war and tried to restore the queen, but Congress had other ideas, and the sugar planters had better connections. 5 years later, in 1898, the U.S. annexed Hawaii despite the fact that the majority of native Hawaiians opposed it and had signed petitions against annexation. No vote, no consent, just a done deal. Queen Liliuokalani spent her remaining years under house arrest for a time, then lived quietly until her death in 1917, never having regained her throne. Congress formally apologized in 1993, exactly 100 years later, acknowledging that the overthrow was illegal and that Native Hawaiians never relinquished their sovereignty. It's one of the few times the U.S. government has admitted that maybe, just maybe, the whole manifest destiny thing got a little out of hand. But while Hawaii was dealing with corporate-backed coups, up in Idaho, workers were dealing with something that looked remarkably like open warfare. Idaho, the Coeur d'Alene mining wars picture. The silver mining country of northern Idaho in the 1890s. Rugged mountains, company towns. And tensions between mine owners and workers that were about to explode into actual armed conflict. Twice. The trouble started in 1892 when mining companies slashed wages and brought in non-union workers. The miners, who belonged to some of the strongest labor unions in the country, weren't having it. What followed was essentially a small war. Union miners seized control of mines. There were shootouts. Dynamite was involved. Yes, dynamite. And several people died. The governor declared martial law and called in federal troops. Over 1,000 miners were rounded up and imprisoned in outdoor stockades called bullpens, essentially just fenced-off areas with no shelter. No trials, no charges for most of them. Just indefinite detention in the Idaho wilderness. Some were held for months. When things calmed down, the miners thought they'd won some concessions, but then it happened again in 1899 because apparently nobody learned anything the first time. More violence, more federal troops, more mass arrests. This time the military occupation lasted even longer. Union leaders were arrested and held without bail. The state essentially suspended habeas corpus, which is supposed to be one of those fundamental rights you can't just ignore. Federal troops occupied the mining district for over 2 years. The whole thing reads like a practice run for some of the labor conflicts that would shake the country in the early 20th century. Eventually, the dust settled. Unions regained some ground, but not before the government had made it very clear that it was willing to use military force against its own citizens if labor disputes got too spicy. And speaking of getting spicy, let's head south to Illinois. Illinois, the East St. Louis Massacre of 1917. East St. Louis in 1917 was a city on edge. The Great Migration was in full swing, with thousands of Black Americans leaving the South for industrial jobs in the North. White workers in East St. Louis saw this as competition for jobs and housing, and tensions were rising like water in a kettle someone forgot to turn off. On July 2nd, 1917, the kettle boiled over. For 3 days, white mobs attacked Black neighborhoods with a level of organization that suggests this wasn't spontaneous rage, but coordinated violence. Homes were set on fire, and people were pulled from streetcars and beaten. Entire blocks were destroyed. The death toll is disputed. Official reports said around 40 people died, but historians believe the real number was somewhere between 100 and 250. Thousands of Black residents lost their homes and fled the city. And here's the really disturbing part. The police and National Guard, who were supposed to protect citizens, largely stood by and watched. Some reports suggest soldiers and police actually participated in the violence or actively disarmed Black residents trying to defend themselves while letting white mobs continue their attacks. It was one of the deadliest race massacres in American history, and it happened in broad daylight in a major industrial city while authorities did essentially nothing. The aftermath was almost as bad. Only a handful of white people were prosecuted, and most got light sentences. Meanwhile, dozens of Black residents were arrested and convicted for trying to defend themselves or their property. The massacre sent shockwaves across the country and prompted protests and investigations, but justice was notably absent. The whole thing serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the darkest moments in history happen not because nobody was watching, but because the people watching chose to do nothing. And speaking of people choosing to do terrible things in broad daylight, let's talk about Indiana. Indiana, the KKK capital of America. In the 1920s, if you wanted to find the heartland of the Ku Klux Klan, you wouldn't look in the Deep South, you'd look at Indiana. Nearly 30% of white men in the state were members, which means if you walk down a street in any Indiana town, statistically, every third guy you passed was probably in the Klan. Let that sink in for a moment. We're not talking about a fringe extremist group operating in shadows. This was mainstream. The Klan in Indiana wasn't just burning crosses in rural areas. They were running the state. They elected governors, mayors, and legislators. They controlled school boards and police departments. The Grand Dragon, a man named D.C. Stevenson, essentially ran Indiana politics for a few years. He had so much power that politicians lined up to kiss his ring, sometimes literally. The Klan presented itself as a defender of traditional values and 100% Americanism, which was code for white Protestant supremacy and hatred of Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and Black Americans. They held massive rallies and parades in broad daylight. Thousands of Klansmen marching down Main Street in their robes wasn't shocking. It was just Tuesday. The whole thing came crashing down in 1925 when Stevenson was convicted of kidnapping and harming a woman who later died. Suddenly, being associated with the Klan became a political liability. Membership plummeted. Politicians who'd been happy to take Klan endorsements suddenly pretended they'd never heard of the organization. By the end of the decade, the Klan's power in Indiana was broken. But the fact that it happened at all, that an openly bigoted organization could essentially control an entire state's government in the 20th century, is one of those historical facts that feels almost impossible until you look at the receipts. And speaking of uncomfortable historical receipts, let's head to Iowa. Iowa, the Spirit Lake Massacre. In March of 1857, a small group of settlers living near Spirit Lake in northwestern Iowa experienced one of the most violent events in the state's frontier history. A band of Wapakute Dakota warriors, led by a man named Inkpaduta, attacked several settlements, killing 34 people and taking 4 women captive. The attacks were brutal, and the survivors' accounts were harrowing. Though it's worth noting that Inkpaduta's band had themselves been driven from their lands, cheated by traders, and left to starve through a bitter winter with no support from the government that had supposedly made treaties with them. Not that this justifies violence, but context matters. The captives were held for several months before being ransomed, and their stories were published widely and used as anti-native propaganda for decades. Politicians and newspapers portrayed the event as evidence that all Native Americans were savage and dangerous, conveniently ignoring the years of broken treaties and forced removals that had preceded it. Iowa used the Spirit Lake incident as justification for removing the remaining Dakota people from the state entirely. Within a few years, virtually all Native Americans had been forced out of Iowa, and the state's eastern tribes had been relocated to reservations in Kansas and Nebraska, far from their ancestral homelands. The Spirit Lake Massacre became a founding myth of sorts for Iowa, a story that allowed settlers to see themselves as victims rather than participants in a much larger pattern of displacement and violence. Monuments were erected to the settlers who died. The broader context of why Inkpaduta's band was desperate and starving was mostly forgotten. It's one of those stories where everyone involved suffered, but only one side got to write the history books. And speaking of stories where the official narrative took a while to reflect reality, let's head to Kansas. Kansas, Bleeding Kansas. Between 1854 and 1861, Kansas was less a territory and more a battlefield preview for the Civil War that was about to tear the country apart. Congress had decided that Kansas would vote on whether to be a slave state or a free state, which seemed democratic until you realize it meant both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces started flooding into the territory trying to outvote each other. And when voting didn't work, they moved on to more direct methods of persuasion, like violence, lots of violence. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed into Kansas to intimidate voters and attack anti-slavery settlements. Anti-slavery settlers formed militias and fought back. Towns were burned, people were killed in raids, and the territorial government descended into chaos with 2 rival legislatures claiming authority. Enter John Brown, an abolitionist who believed God had called him to destroy slavery by any means necessary. In May of 1856, Brown and a group including several of his sons went to Pottawatomie Creek, dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes in the middle of the night, and killed them with broadswords. Just hacked them to death. Brown's massacre was one of dozens of violent episodes during Bleeding Kansas, but it became infamous because of its brutality and because Brown himself would later become a polarizing figure after his raid on Harper's Ferry. The violence in Kansas killed around 56 people and displaced hundreds more before Kansas was finally admitted as a free state in 1861. By then, the Civil War had started, so the whole question became moot anyway. But Bleeding Kansas served as a dress rehearsal for the larger conflict, proving that Americans were absolutely willing to kill each other over the question of slavery. And honestly, after all that violence, you'd think people would need a break, but Kentucky had other ideas. Kentucky, the Black Patch Tobacco Wars. From 1904 to 1909, parts of western Kentucky and Tennessee looked less like tobacco country and more like a war zone, all because of a dispute over crop prices. Tobacco farmers were angry that large companies were buying their crops at rock-bottom prices and colluding to keep prices low. Reasonable complaint. Less reasonable was their solution: forming vigilante groups called Night Riders, who terrorized anyone who sold tobacco to the big companies. These weren't just protest groups. They were organized like military units with leaders, plans, and matching masks. They'd ride into town at night, sometimes hundreds strong, burn warehouses full of tobacco, destroy crops, whip farmers who refused to join their association, and occasionally shoot people. They blew up tobacco plants with dynamite. They'd surround entire towns and hold them hostage while they carried out their raids. Law enforcement was either sympathetic, intimidated, or infiltrated, so they did basically nothing. The governor eventually had to declare martial law in multiple counties and send in the state militia to restore order. It took years to bring the violence under control. Dozens of people were killed, hundreds were injured, and millions of dollars in property was destroyed. Some night riders were eventually caught and prosecuted, but many were never identified, protected by a code of silence in their communities. The tobacco wars are one of those bizarre episodes where you can almost understand the farmers' frustration with corporate monopolies, but then they went and formed what was essentially a domestic terrorist organization, and suddenly your sympathy evaporates faster than morning dew in July. The whole thing was finally resolved through a combination of military force and economic changes, but not before Kentucky proved that when people feel economically desperate, things can get violent remarkably quickly. And speaking of violence over resources, let's float down to Louisiana. Louisiana, the Colfax Massacre of 1873. On Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1873, the small town of Colfax in central Louisiana became the site of one of the deadliest incidents of racial violence during Reconstruction. After a disputed gubernatorial election left Louisiana with two rival governments, both sides tried to control local parishes. In Grant Parish, black citizens and white Republicans occupied the courthouse to prevent it from being seized by white supremacist Democrats. They held the courthouse for 3 weeks. On Easter, an armed white militia, estimates suggest between 150 and 300 men, attacked the courthouse. The defenders were outnumbered and outgunned. After a brief battle, the black defenders tried to surrender. That's when things went from bad to horrific. Even after surrendering, somewhere between 60 and 150 black men were executed. Some were shot while being held prisoner. Others were hunted down as they tried to flee. The exact death toll is unknown because bodies were dumped in the Red River or buried in unmarked graves. 3 white men died in the initial fighting. In the aftermath, federal authorities tried to prosecute the perpetrators under the new civil rights laws, and 97 men were indicted. Only 9 went to trial. Of those, 3 were convicted. The case went to the Supreme Court, which overturned the convictions and gutted the federal government's ability to protect civil rights, a decision that would have consequences for decades. Perhaps most insultingly, a historical marker at the site referred to the massacre as the Colfax Riot for over a century, as if both sides were equally responsible. It wasn't corrected to read massacre until 2021. The Colfax Massacre marked one of the bloodiest days of Reconstruction and signaled that the federal government was abandoning its commitment to protecting black civil rights in the South. And speaking of erasure, let's head north to a place where an entire community was deliberately wiped from existence. Maine, the Malaga Island eviction Maine, likes to present itself as progressive and forward-thinking. So the story of Malaga Island is the kind of thing that doesn't make it into the tourist brochures. Malaga was a small island off the coast near Phippsburg, home to a mixed-race community of fishermen and their families who'd lived there for generations. They weren't wealthy, but they were self-sufficient, making their living from the sea. But to the white residents of the mainland, Malaga Island was an embarrassment, a visible reminder that interracial families existed in lily white Maine. In 1912, the state government decided to solve this problem by making the island disappear. The governor authorized the eviction of all residents. Families were given almost no notice. Some were forcibly committed to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, a state institution, even though there was no evidence they were mentally disabled. Their only crime was being poor and mixed race. The homes on Malaga were demolished or burned. And here's where it gets even darker. The state dug up the island's cemetery and moved the remains to the mainland, reburying them in a mass grave near the institution. The goal was to erase any evidence that the community had ever existed. It worked for a while. For decades, Malaga Island was barely mentioned in Maine's history. It wasn't until the late 20th century that researchers and activists began uncovering what had happened and demanding acknowledgement. Maine eventually apologized in 2010 and erected a memorial, but the fact that a state government forcibly institutionalized people, destroyed their homes, and literally dug up their dead to hide evidence of their existence is the kind of thing that seems like it should be from the 19th century, not 1912. But apparently, Maine was ahead of its time in all the wrong ways. Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay Oyster Wars. For nearly a century, the Chesapeake Bay was the site of an ongoing armed conflict that sounds too absurd to be real, but absolutely was. From the 1860s through the 1950s, watermen fought brutal battles over oyster beds, turning one of America's most productive fisheries into a battlefield. Oysters were big business, and the oyster beds in the Chesapeake were among the richest in the world. Problem was, everybody wanted them. Virginia watermen would cross into Maryland waters. Maryland watermen would fight back. Out-of-state boats would dredge illegally. Local boats would try to stop them. And by try to stop them, I mean with guns. Lots of guns. There were nighttime raids, boats set on fire, shootouts in the middle of the bay. Dozens of people were killed over the decades. It got so bad that Maryland created an entire naval force, the Oyster Navy, specifically to patrol the bay and enforce oyster laws. Imagine that job interview. So what will I be doing? Oh, Sati, you'll be cruising around in a patrol boat stopping oyster pirates from shooting each other. The Oyster Navy was actually a real thing, with real armed vessels, and it operated for decades. Some historians call the Chesapeake Bay Oyster Wars the longest-running armed conflict in American history, which is saying something for a country that's had actual wars. The violence didn't really end until the oyster population crashed in the mid-20th century due to overharvesting and pollution. Hard to fight over oysters when there are barely any oysters left. Modern conservation efforts have tried to restore the bay's oyster population, but it's never recovered to its 19th century levels. The whole thing is a reminder that humans will fight over pretty much anything valuable, including shellfish. And speaking of fighting over things that seem absurd in hindsight, let's head up to Massachusetts. We're 20 secrets deep into this quiet American tour, and if you're still awake, your eyelids are probably getting heavier. Good. That means the history is working. Let's keep going. Massachusetts, the Salem Witch Trials. In 1692, the small town of Salem, Massachusetts, became the setting for one of the most bizarre episodes of mass hysteria in American history. It started in January when a group of young girls began having fits, screaming, contorting their bodies, claiming they were being tormented by invisible forces. When pressed to explain who was tormenting them, they started naming names. And once they started, they couldn't stop. Over the next several months, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 20 were executed. 14 were women, 5 were men, and 1, a man named Giles Corey, died in a particularly horrible way. Corey refused to enter a plea, which meant he couldn't be tried. So the authorities decided to press him to death, literally placing heavy stones on his chest until he either agreed to plead or died. According to legend, his last words were, "More weight." He died after 2 days. The trials themselves were a nightmare of unreliable evidence and circular logic. Spectral evidence claims that the accused person's spirit had appeared to the accuser in a dream or vision, was admitted in court, which is roughly as reliable as convicting someone based on a horoscope. People were accused based on old grudges, property disputes, and social tensions. Being a little too independent, a little too successful, or just generally unlikable could get you accused. The trials finally ended in May of 1693 when the governor's wife was accused, and suddenly everyone realized maybe this whole thing had gotten out of hand. The colony eventually admitted the trials were a mistake and offered compensation to the victims' families. But by then, 20 people were dead, families were destroyed, and Salem had earned itself a permanent place in history as a cautionary tale about what happens when fear, superstition, and mob mentality collide. Modern historians have tried to explain what caused the hysteria. Theories range from ergot poisoning from contaminated grain to good old-fashioned teenage rebellion, but whatever the cause, the result was a community tearing itself apart over imaginary crimes. And speaking of communities being torn apart, though for very different reasons, let's head west to Michigan. Michigan, the Battle of the Overpass. On May 26, 1937, a group of United Auto Workers organizers decided to hand out Union flyers at the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan. What happened next became one of the most photographed instances of labor violence in American history. As the organizers walked onto an overpass leading to the plant, they were met by Ford's private security force, a group called the Service Department that was less security and more paramilitary organization. These weren't rent-a-cops checking badges. We're talking about a private army of around 3,000 men who'd been specifically hired to prevent union organizing through intimidation and violence. The security guards attacked the organizers on the overpass, beating them severely while newspaper photographers captured the whole thing on film. The photographs, showing well-dressed Union men being attacked by thugs, were published in newspapers across the country and became iconic images of the labor movement. What made the Battle of the Overpass particularly significant wasn't just the violence, but what it revealed about Ford's operations. The service department, run by a former boxer named Harry Bennett, operated like a secret police force inside the company. They spied on workers, broke up union meetings, and maintained control through fear. Workers suspected of union sympathies would be fired or beaten. The department had its own jail inside the plant, a jail in a car factory. Ford was one of the last major auto manufacturers to resist unionization, holding out until 1941, 4 years after the overpass incident. By then, public opinion had turned against the company's tactics, and the photographs from that May Day in '37 had played a significant role in changing hearts and minds. It's a reminder that sometimes progress happens not because powerful people suddenly become generous, but because their bad behavior gets caught on camera. And speaking of things getting caught, though in a much more permanent and terrible way, let's drift northwest to Minnesota. Minnesota, the largest mass execution in U.S. history, on December 26, 1862, in the town of Mankato, Minnesota. 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously from a single scaffold. It remains the largest mass execution in American history, and the story of how it happened is a complicated tangle of broken treaties, starvation, warfare, and rushed justice. The Dakota War of 1862 began after years of the U.S. government failing to deliver promised payments and food supplies to Dakota tribes in Minnesota. Facing starvation, some Dakota warriors attacked settlements in August of that year. The conflict lasted 6 weeks and resulted in the deaths of several hundred settlers and soldiers, as well as an unknown number of Dakota people. After the war ended, over 300 Dakota men were sentenced to death by military tribunals. The trials were incredibly rushed. Some lasted less than 5 minutes. Evidence was thin, translations were poor, and many of the condemned had questionable involvement in the actual fighting. President Lincoln personally reviewed all 303 cases and commuted most of the sentences, but he approved 39 executions. One man received a last minute reprieve, bringing the final number to 38. On the day after Christmas, a crowd of thousands gathered to watch the hanging. The men sang Dakota death songs as the platform dropped. Several historians have since argued that some of the executed men were innocent, convicted based on mistaken identity or false testimony. After the execution, the remaining Dakota people in Minnesota, including those who'd helped settlers or remained neutral during the war, were expelled from the state. Around 1600, Dakota were held in an internment camp over the winter of 62 to 63, where poor conditions led to hundreds of deaths from disease. The Dakota who were hanged in Mankato were buried in a mass grave, though their bodies were later dug up by local doctors who wanted them for medical study, which somehow manages to make an already dark story even darker. And speaking of dark stories that somehow get worse the more you learn about them, let's head south to Mississippi. Mississippi, the murder of Emmett Till. In the summer of 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago named Emmett Till went to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. He'd never been to the Deep South before, and his mother warned him to be careful, to mind the different rules, to remember that things work differently down there. On August 24th, Till and some cousins went to a small grocery store owned by a white couple, Roy and Carolyn Bryant. What exactly happened inside the store has been debated for decades, but according to Carolyn Bryant, Till Wolfe whistled at her. Years later, she would admit she'd lied about parts of her story, but in 1955, her word was enough. 4 days later, in the middle of the night, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Millam showed up at the house where Till was staying. They forced him into their truck at gunpoint. 3 days later, Till's body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River. He'd been beaten so severely he was barely recognizable. His mother, Mamie Till Bradley, made a decision that would change history. She insisted on an open casket funeral in Chicago. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her son. Thousands came to view his body. Jet magazine published photographs. The images shocked the nation and galvanized the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, Bryant and Milam were put on trial for murder. The trial lasted 5 days. The all-white jury deliberated for 67 minutes before acquitting both men. One juror later said it would have been faster, but they'd stopped to have a soda. Protected by double jeopardy laws, Bryant and Milam later admitted to the murder in a Look magazine interview, describing the killing in detail for money. They never faced consequences. Emmett Till's murder became a catalyst for change, the proof that the injustice of the segregated South couldn't continue. But for his mother, no amount of historical significance could bring her son back. And speaking of state-sanctioned violence disguised as something else, let's head west to Missouri. Order 44, the Extermination Order. In 1838, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs issued Executive Order 44, which stated that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Let me say that again. A sitting American governor issued a legal order calling for the extermination of a religious group. That's not hyperbole or historical exaggeration. The word exterminated is right there in the official document. The order came after years of escalating tensions between Mormon settlers and other Missouri residents over land, politics, and religious differences. There had been violence on both sides, property destruction, and what amounted to a small civil war in some counties. But the governor's response was to essentially declare open season on an entire religious group. Following the order, Missouri militias attacked Mormon settlements. The Hans Mill massacre occurred just 3 days after the order was issued, when a militia attacked a Mormon settlement and killed 17 men and boys. Mormon leader Joseph Smith and other church leaders were arrested and held in Liberty Jail for months without trial. By early 1839, around 12,000 Mormons had fled Missouri for Illinois, abandoning their homes and property. Many crossed the Mississippi River in the middle of winter with almost nothing. The extermination order remained technically on the books until 1976, 138 years later, when Governor Christopher Bond finally formally rescinded it. It stands as the only executive order in American history explicitly calling for the extermination of a religious group, which is one of those facts that seems too extreme to be true until you read the actual document. And speaking of extreme reactions to relatively mundane problems, though in a very different context, let's head northwest to Montana. Montana, the speculator mine disaster. On June 8th, 1917, a fire broke out in the speculator mine in Butte, Montana, nearly 3,000 feet underground. By the time the fire was extinguished, 168 miners were dead, making it the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in American history. But here's the thing that makes this disaster particularly awful. Most of the men didn't burn to death. They suffocated, trapped underground as smoke and toxic gases filled the tunnels. Some managed to leave notes for their families. Others huddled together in dead-end shafts, hoping for rescue that came too late or not at all. The fire started when an exposed electrical cable ignited oil-soaked timbers in the shaft. The mine's ventilation system, instead of clearing the smoke, actually spread it throughout the connected tunnels of the speculator and neighboring Granite Mountain mine. Men who were working in completely different areas suddenly found themselves surrounded by smoke with no way out. Rescue efforts were hampered by the toxic gases and the enormous depth of the shafts. It took days to recover all the bodies. The mining company, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which essentially ran Butte like a private fiefdom, faced minimal consequences. There were investigations, recommendations were made for better safety standards, but actual enforcement was another matter entirely. The miners, understandably, were outraged. Within weeks, they organized a strike demanding better safety conditions. The strike spread and became part of a larger labor movement across the Western mining industry. Many of the strike leaders were arrested. Some were accused of being German sympathizers or radicals. This was during World War I, so such accusations could destroy lives. The speculator disaster and the response to it highlighted how little value mining companies placed on workers' lives and how willing the government was to side with corporations over labor. The disaster led to some improvements in mine safety, but those improvements came too late for the 168 men who died that June. And speaking of institutions failing to protect the vulnerable, let's head east to Nebraska. Nebraska, stolen native children from 1884 to 1934, the Genoa Indian Industrial School in Nebraska was part of a nationwide system designed to, in the words of its founder, kill the Indian, save the man. The premise was simple and horrifying. Forcibly remove Native American children from their families and culture, place them in boarding schools, and strip away everything that made them who they were. At Genoa and dozens of schools like it across the country, children as young as 5 were taken from their families, sometimes by force, sometimes by coercion, sometimes by threats that food rations would be withheld if parents didn't comply. Once at the schools, children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their religions, or wearing traditional clothing. Their hair was cut, their names were changed to English ones, and they were punished for any display of their culture. Punishments ranged from beatings to solitary confinement to withholding food. Children were essentially used as unpaid labor, working in the school's fields and workshops under the guise of vocational training. The conditions were often terrible: overcrowding, poor nutrition, inadequate medical care. Disease spread rapidly through the dormitories. Many children died and were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. Many others ran away and tried to walk hundreds of miles home, sometimes dying in the attempt. The trauma lasted for generations. Children returned home unable to speak their own language, disconnected from their culture, often unable to relate to their families. Parents had children taken away for years and returned as strangers. The stated goal of the boarding school system was cultural genocide, and it was terrifyingly effective at destroying languages, traditions, and family structures. The Genoa school closed in 34, but its legacy and the legacy of the entire boarding school system continues to affect Native communities today. And speaking of legacies that continue to affect communities, let's head west to Nevada. Nevada nuclear testing. Between 1951 and 1992, the U.S. government detonated 928 nuclear weapons at the Nevada test site, about 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. 100 of those were above ground detonations, meaning they created massive mushroom clouds that could be seen from the city. For a while in the 1950s, watching nuclear explosions from hotel rooftops was actually a tourist attraction in Vegas. Come for the slots, stay for the apocalypse. Except it wasn't entertainment for the people living downwind. Communities in Nevada and Utah, particularly small towns to the north and east of the test site, were showered with radioactive fallout every time the wind blew wrong. The government assured everyone it was perfectly safe. It was not perfectly safe. Cancer rates in these downwind communities skyrocketed. Thyroid cancer, leukemia, bone cancer rates were significantly higher than the national average. People called it downwinder syndrome. Sheep and cattle died in large numbers after grazing on contaminated ground. But for decades, the government denied any connection between the tests and the health problems. It wasn't until 1990, with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, that the government finally acknowledged the harm and began offering compensation to affected individuals. Even then, the payments were limited, the eligibility criteria were strict, and many people who'd gotten sick were excluded. The testing itself continued until 92, though underground after the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 63 banned above ground tests. The Nevada test site is now a tourist attraction where you can take tours and see the giant craters left by underground detonations. It's surreal. Standing in the desert, looking at human-made craters the size of football fields, and knowing that for 40 years, the government regularly set off nuclear weapons a short drive from a major city. And speaking of government programs that seemed like a good idea to someone, but definitely weren't, let's head to New Hampshire. New Hampshire, the eugenics program. From 1917 to the 1960s, New Hampshire ran a forced sterilization program targeting people the state deemed feeble-minded or defective, which were essentially code words for poor, disabled, mentally ill, or otherwise undesirable. Over 700 people, mostly women, institutionalized individuals, and minorities, were sterilized against their will under the state's eugenics law. The eugenics movement was huge in early 20th century America, based on the pseudoscientific idea that you could improve humanity by preventing undesirable people from reproducing. New Hampshire was far from alone. Over 30 states had similar laws, but that doesn't make it any less horrifying. People were sterilized for being poor, for having disabilities, for being considered promiscuous, for having low scores on deeply flawed intelligence tests. Sometimes parents had their children sterilized without the child's knowledge. Sometimes women were sterilized during other medical procedures and weren't told until later. The criteria for who qualified as feeble-minded were vague and subjective, often based more on class and social status than any actual medical condition. Being an unwed mother, being on welfare, or simply being deemed morally deficient could be enough. The state's eugenics program quietly wound down in the 60s as the scientific community finally acknowledged that eugenics was racist pseudoscience with no basis in actual genetics. But the law wasn't formally repealed until much later, and the state never officially apologized or offered compensation to victims. Many victims never spoke publicly about what happened, carrying the shame and trauma in silence. It's one of those dark chapters where the cruelty was bureaucratic and clinical, carried out by doctors and social workers who genuinely believed they were improving society. And speaking of scientific failures with devastating human costs, let's head to New Jersey. New Jersey, the Radium Girls. In the 1920s, young women working at a watch dial factory in Orange, New Jersey had what seemed like a pretty good job. They painted numbers on watch faces with luminous paint that glowed in the dark, allowing people to read their watches at night. The work required precision, and the women were taught to lick their brushes to get a fine point. The paint contained radium, and the factory owners assured everyone it was completely safe. It was not completely safe. It was, in fact, extremely deadly. The women started getting sick. Their teeth fell out. Their jaws deteriorated. Bones became so brittle they'd fracture from minor bumps. Some developed tumors. The radium had accumulated in their bodies, particularly in their bones, emitting radiation that slowly destroyed them from the inside. When the women tried to find out what was wrong, doctors were baffled or dismissive. The company insisted the paint was harmless and suggested the women's symptoms were due to other causes. Maybe they just had bad hygiene. Maybe it was syphilis. Maybe they were making it up for attention. All lies. The company knew radium was dangerous. They'd taken precautions to protect their scientists and executives from exposure while telling the factory workers it was safe enough to put in their mouths. Several women, who became known as the Radium Girls, sued the company. The case dragged on for years. The women were dying, some too weak to even raise their arms to take the oath in court, but they persisted. In 1928, they finally won a settlement. More importantly, their case led to major changes in labor law, including the right of workers to sue employers for occupational diseases. The Radium Girls helped establish that companies have a responsibility to protect workers from known hazards. But it came too late for the dozens of women who'd already died, and the many more who would die in the following years. And speaking of things that came too late, let's head southwest to New Mexico. 30 states. We're exactly halfway through this long, dark American atlas. The night is deep now. If you're drifting, that's perfectly fine. You've already learned things tonight that most textbooks wouldn't touch. The remaining 20 states will be here when you wake up. New Mexico, the first nuclear explosion, on July 16th, 1945. In a desert basin called Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, which should have been a hint, the US government detonated the first nuclear weapon in human history. The Trinity test was the culmination of the Manhattan Project, and it worked spectacularly, producing a blast equivalent to about 22,000 tons of TNT and a mushroom cloud that rose over 7 miles into the air. You could see the flash from nearly 200 miles away. But here's what didn't happen. Nobody warned the nearby communities. Nobody evacuated the ranchers living downwind. Nobody told the residents of Tularosa, Carrizozo, or other nearby towns that they were about to be exposed to radioactive fallout. The fallout from the Trinity blast spread across New Mexico and into neighboring states, depositing radioactive particles on farms, ranches, and towns. People reported seeing a strange white ash falling from the sky the next day. Some touched it, not knowing what it was. Livestock drank contaminated water. Crops absorbed radioactive isotopes. In the decades that followed, cancer rates in communities downwind of the Trinity site were significantly higher than average. Families called it Trinity sickness. They watched relatives die from cancers that seemed to cluster in ways that couldn't be coincidental. But for decades, they received no acknowledgement and no compensation. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, passed in 1990 to compensate downwinders affected by nuclear testing in Nevada, specifically excluded New Mexico. It took until 2024, 79 years after the test, for Congress to finally pass legislation making Trinity downwinders eligible for compensation. By then, most of the people who'd been directly exposed to the original fallout were long dead. The Trinity site is now a National Historic Landmark, open to the public twice a year. You can visit Ground Zero, though the soil is still slightly radioactive. It's one of those places where history feels heavy, where you can almost feel the weight of what happened there and all the decisions that followed. And speaking of heavy history, let's head to New York. New York, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. On March 25th, 1911, on a Saturday afternoon in Manhattan, fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Ash Building, home to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Within 18 minutes, 146 garment workers were dead, most of them young immigrant women, some as young as 14. The fire itself was devastating, but what made it a tragedy was that the exits were locked. The factory owners had locked the doors to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing fabric. When the fire started spreading rapidly through cotton fabric and tissue paper patterns, the workers panicked and rushed to the exits, only to find them bolted shut. Some tried to escape down the fire escape, but it collapsed under the weight of too many people. Some crowded into the elevators until those stopped running. And some, faced with a choice between burning or jumping, chose to jump from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors onto the sidewalk below. Firefighters arrived quickly, but their ladders only reached the 6th floor. The safety nets they held were meant for individual jumpers, not groups of people holding hands as they leapt. The nets tore. Passersby watched in horror as bodies fell. In the aftermath, the factory owners were tried for manslaughter. They were acquitted. The jury decided that the prosecution hadn't proven the owners knew the doors were locked, even though it was standard practice. The owners later won an insurance settlement that paid them more per victim than the victims' families received in a civil suit. The Triangle Fire shocked the nation and became a rallying point for labor reform. Within a few years, New York passed dozens of new workplace safety laws, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union gained strength. But those reforms came too late for the 146 workers who died that Saturday afternoon because someone decided productivity was more important than unlocked doors. And speaking of power being used in devastating ways, let's head south to North Carolina. North Carolina, the Wilmington coup of 1898. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 was a prosperous port city with a majority black population and a biracial local government that included black aldermen, police officers, and magistrates. Then, in November of that year, white supremacists overthrew the elected government in what remains the only successful coup d'etat in American history. The plotters, led by prominent white business leaders and former Confederate officers, had been planning for months. They objected to black political participation and to the city's Republican government. On November 10th, an armed mob of around 2,000 white men attacked black neighborhoods, killed an estimated 60 to 300 black citizens, burned the office of the black-owned newspaper, and forced the mayor and aldermen to resign at gunpoint. The coup leaders then installed their own government. No one was prosecuted. Federal authorities declined to intervene. The new government remained in power. In the days that followed, black professionals, business owners, and political leaders were banished from the city, often with only hours to pack. Black property was seized. The city's black middle class was essentially destroyed overnight. For decades afterward, Wilmington's history books described the events as a race riot caused by black aggression, rather than what it actually was: a planned insurrection by white supremacists who used violence to seize political power. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began re-examining the evidence and calling it what it was: a coup and a massacre. The Wilmington coup demonstrated that Reconstruction's gains for black political participation could be violently reversed with no consequences and it set a template for voter suppression and political violence that would be repeated across the South in the following decades. And speaking of widespread policies that devastated communities, let's head northwest to North Dakota. North Dakota, the forced allotment of native land. The Dawes Act of 1887, also called the General Allotment Act, was sold to the American public as a way to help Native Americans by giving them individual land ownership and encouraging them to become farmers. What it actually did was destroy tribal land holdings and transfer millions of acres to white settlers. Here's how it worked. Communal tribal lands were broken up into individual plots called allotments, typically 160 acres per family. Native Americans were assigned these plots. Any land left over after allotment, and there was always land left over, was declared surplus and open to white settlement. In North Dakota and across the country, tribes lost over 90 million acres this way. On North Dakota reservations, the loss was particularly devastating. The Fort Berthold Reservation alone lost hundreds of thousands of acres. The idea that Native Americans would become prosperous farmers ignored the fact that much of the allotted land was unsuitable for agriculture, and that farming wasn't traditionally how many tribes sustained themselves. Even worse, individual landowners could sell their allotments, and many did, often out of economic desperation or pressure from land speculators. Some lost their land to property taxes they couldn't pay. The Dawes Act stayed in effect until 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act finally ended allotment and returned some land to tribal control. But by then, the damage was done. Tribal economies had been devastated, communal land holdings were fractured, and millions of acres were permanently lost. The allotment system was yet another example of policy that looked benevolent on paper but was designed to break up tribal sovereignty and transfer native land to white ownership. And speaking of things that look different on the surface than what they really were, let's head east to Ohio. Ohio, the Kent State Massacre. On May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students at Kent State University, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. The shootings occurred during a protest against the American invasion of Cambodia and the expansion of the Vietnam War. The protest had been going on for several days. Some students had thrown rocks and tear gas canisters back at guardsmen. But on that Monday afternoon, the situation was relatively calm when, without warning, 28 guardsmen turned and fired into the crowd. They fired for 13 seconds, 67 rounds. 4 students died. Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krause, William Schroeder, and Sandra Scheuer. Miller and Krause had been protesting. Schroeder and Scheuer were just walking to class. The closest student who was shot had been about 60 feet away from the guardsmen. Some of the wounded were hundreds of feet away. The shootings stunned the nation. A photograph of a young woman kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body became one of the iconic images of the anti-war movement. Universities across the country erupted in protests, and over 4 million students participated in a strike. 8 of the guardsmen were eventually indicted for federal civil rights violations, but all charges were dismissed. A civil lawsuit resulted in a small settlement and a statement of regret from the state of Ohio, but no one was ever convicted. The Kent State shootings remain a reminder of how quickly peaceful protest can turn deadly when authorities respond with force rather than restraint. They also marked a turning point in public opinion about the Vietnam War, as many Americans who'd been ambivalent about the anti-war movement suddenly questioned whether the conflict was worth shooting college students over. And speaking of violence that changed how Americans viewed their government, let's head south to Oklahoma. Oklahoma, the Tulsa Race Massacre. On the evening of May 31st, 1921, Tulsa's Greenwood District was one of the wealthiest black communities in America, known as Black Wall Street. By the morning of June 2nd, 35 blocks were burned to the ground, up to 300 people were dead, and 10,000 were left homeless. It started with an accusation. A young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of attacking a white woman in an elevator. The accusation was almost certainly false. Most historians believe he simply stumbled and grabbed her arm to steady himself. But in 1921 Tulsa, the accusation was enough. A white mob gathered at the courthouse where Rowland was being held. A group of armed black men, some of them World War I veterans, came to the courthouse to prevent a lynching. Gunfire broke out, and then White Tulsa decided to destroy Greenwood entirely. Over the next 16 hours, white mobs, some deputized by city officials, invaded Greenwood. They looted homes and businesses before burning them. Witnesses reported that some attackers arrived in airplanes and dropped incendiary devices, making it one of the first aerial bombardments of an American city. Firefighters were prevented from extinguishing the blazes. Black residents who tried to defend their property were shot. Thousands were rounded up and held in internment camps. The official death toll was listed as 36, but mass graves found in recent years suggest the real number was much higher. After the massacre, the city tried to prevent Greenwood from being rebuilt by changing zoning laws. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. The massacre was essentially erased from Oklahoma's history books for decades, not taught in schools, barely mentioned in official histories. It wasn't until the late 1990s that serious efforts began to uncover the truth. And speaking of truths that took far too long to acknowledge, let's head to Oregon. Oregon, the exclusion laws. Oregon has a progressive reputation today, but it was founded as essentially a whites-only state. When Oregon's constitution was drafted in 1857, it included a black exclusion clause that made it illegal for black people to live in, work in, or own property in the state. Oregon is the only state admitted to the Union with such a clause in its constitution. The exclusion law had its roots in earlier territorial laws. In 1844, Oregon's provisional government passed a law requiring all black people to leave the territory within 2 years or face public whipping. That particular penalty was later changed to forced labor, which somehow wasn't much of an improvement. When Oregon became a state in 1859, the exclusion clause was part of the deal. The law was rarely enforced. There weren't many black people in Oregon to exclude, but it remained on the books as a message about who was and wasn't welcome. The clause was technically invalidated by the 14th Amendment in 1868, but Oregon voters didn't actually vote to remove it from the state constitution until 1926. Even then, it wasn't fully cleaned out of the legal code until 2002. 2002. That means there were people using the internet and cell phones while Oregon still had racist language in its constitution. The exclusion laws set a tone for Oregon that persisted long after they were gone. Throughout the 20th century, Oregon had restrictive housing covenants, redlining, and other policies that kept communities segregated. Portland, Oregon's largest city, was one of the whitest major cities in America for decades. The legacy of those exclusion laws still affects the state's demographics and race relations today. And speaking of fires that never quite went out, let's head to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, the Centralia mine fire. In May of 1962, someone in Centralia, Pennsylvania, decided to clean up the town dump by burning the trash. Standard practice at the time, except this particular dump was in an abandoned strip mine connected to a vast network of coal mines beneath the town. The fire spread into the coal seam underground, and then it just kept burning. It's still burning today, 63 years later. The mine fire proved impossible to extinguish. Crews tried digging trenches, pouring water, pumping foam. Nothing worked. The fire was too deep, the coal too abundant, the mine network too extensive. Carbon monoxide started venting through cracks in the ground. Sinkholes opened up without warning. The ground became hot enough in places that snow wouldn't stick in winter. Temperatures in some spots exceeded 500 degrees Fahrenheit just below the surface. By the 1980s, it was clear Centralia was dying. The federal government offered to relocate residents, and most accepted. Buildings were demolished, streets were ripped up. Today, only about 5 people still live there, down from over 1,000 in the 1960s. The rest of Centralia is a ghost town. Graffiti covered Highway 61, cracked and buckled by the underground heat, has become a tourist attraction. Super, the fire itself is expected to burn for another 250 years at least, until it runs out of coal to consume. Centralia sits there as a monument to unintended consequences, a reminder that sometimes the smallest mistake can create a problem that outlasts everyone involved. And speaking of unintended consequences, though of a political rather than geological nature, let's head to Rhode Island. Rhode Island, the Dorr Rebellion. In 1842, Rhode Island was still operating under its colonial charter from 1663, which limited voting rights to property owners. This meant that about 60% of white men in the state couldn't vote, and obviously, women and black people couldn't vote either. A lawyer named Thomas Dorr thought this was unreasonable and organized a reform movement to expand suffrage. When the existing government refused to change the rules, Dorr's supporters held their own convention, wrote their own constitution, held their own elections, and declared their own government. For a brief period, Rhode Island had two rival governments, both claiming to be legitimate. The official state government declared martial law. Dorr and his supporters attempted an armed rebellion, including an attack on the state arsenal that failed comically when their cannons didn't fire. Dorr was eventually captured, tried for treason, and sentenced to life in prison, though he was released after a year when public opinion shifted in his favor. The rebellion failed, but it scared the existing government enough that they finally agreed to expand voting rights. Rhode Island adopted a new constitution that removed the property requirement for native-born citizens, though it kept it for naturalized immigrants, which was still progress by 1842 standards. The Dorr Rebellion is one of those episodes where you can't quite decide if it's inspiring or absurd. On one hand, citizens organizing to demand democratic rights. On the other hand, the part where they tried to overthrow the government with cannons that didn't work. Either way, it's a reminder that voting rights in America weren't a given from the start. They had to be fought for, sometimes literally. And speaking of fighting, though for very different stakes, let's head south to South Carolina. South Carolina, Denmark Vesey's conspiracy. In 1822, a formerly enslaved man named Denmark Vesey, who had purchased his freedom after winning a lottery, began planning what would have been the largest slave revolt in American history. Vesey was a carpenter who'd lived in Charleston for years, respected in both black and white communities, which gave him the perfect cover for revolutionary organizing. The plan was audacious. Thousands of enslaved people in and around Charleston would rise up simultaneously, seize the city's arsenal, kill slaveholders, and escape by ship to Haiti, where slavery had been abolished. Vesey spent months recruiting and organizing. He held secret meetings, identified key targets, and supposedly enlisted thousands of participants. He recruited key leaders from different plantations and neighborhoods, creating a network that stretched across the Low Country. The revolt was planned for July 14th. Vesey chose skilled tradesmen, trusted house servants, and field workers, building a coalition across the different segments of Charleston's enslaved population. He studied the successful Haitian Revolution and drew inspiration from it, promising participants that freedom was possible if they were willing to fight for it. It never happened. Someone betrayed the plot before it could launch, likely an enslaved person who told his enslaver about the plan. Authorities arrested suspected conspirators and extracted confessions through interrogation and torture. The trials were swift and secret, with little opportunity for defense. Vesey and 34 other men were executed by hanging. In the panic that followed, South Carolina passed even harsher laws restricting the movement and education of enslaved people. It became illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. Free black people faced increased restrictions and surveillance. The state essentially responded to a thwarted rebellion by making conditions even more oppressive. Charleston's Free Black Church, where some meetings had allegedly occurred, was demolished. Whether Vesey's conspiracy was as large as authorities claimed is debated by historians. Some evidence suggests the plot was real and extensive. Other historians argued may have been exaggerated by white authorities to justify increased repression. Either way, the consequences were real. 35 men dead, and South Carolina's black population, enslaved and free, subjected to even harsher controls. The Vesey conspiracy remains one of the most significant acts of resistance against slavery in American history, and a reminder of the lengths people will go to for freedom. And speaking of resistance being met with overwhelming force, let's head to South Dakota. 40 states in, 10 left. The history has been heavy tonight. Massacres and cover-ups, stolen land and stolen children, courage and cowardice in equal measure. If you've made it this far, you now know more about America's hidden past than most people ever will. Your eyes can close. The last 10 states will carry you the rest of the way. South Dakota, Wounded Knee. On December 29th, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the U.S. 7th Cavalry surrounded a group of Lakota Sioux who were traveling to the reservation. The soldiers were there to disarm the group and prevent any potential trouble. What happened next was one of the darkest moments in American military history. As soldiers attempted to confiscate weapons, a shot was fired. Accounts differ on whether it was accidental or deliberate, or who fired first. The soldiers responded by opening fire with rifles and rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns into the group of around 500 Lakota, including many women, children, and elderly. Between 250 and 300 Lakota were killed, many of them shot while fleeing or trying to surrender. The frozen bodies were later buried in a mass grave. 25 soldiers also died, mostly from friendly fire in the chaos. In the aftermath, 20 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions at Wounded Knee, which is one of those facts that becomes more disturbing the longer you think about it. Efforts to have those medals revoked continue to this day. Wounded Knee marked the end of the Indian Wars and the final crushing of Native American resistance to U.S. expansion. It also marked the failure of the Ghost Dance movement, a spiritual revival that had promised the return of the buffalo and the restoration of native lands. Instead, it ended in a frozen massacre on the South Dakota plains. The site is now a National Historic Landmark, and descendants of both the Lakota who died and the soldiers who were there have worked toward reconciliation. But the name Wounded Knee remains synonymous with tragedy and injustice. And speaking of violence over land and resources, let's head to Tennessee. Tennessee, the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake. In the early 1900s, Reelfoot Lake in northwestern Tennessee became the unlikely setting for a violent conflict over property rights that ended with kidnapping, murder, and the largest mass death sentence in Tennessee history. The lake had formed naturally after the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, and for decades, the surrounding communities had fished its waters freely. But in 1908, a land company claimed ownership of the lake and began charging fees for fishing rights, which went over about as well as you'd expect with people who'd been fishing there for free their entire lives. Local fishermen and farmers formed a group called the Night Riders. Yes, another group with that name, and decided to take matters into their own hands. They weren't just protesting, they were conducting organized raids, destroying property, and intimidating anyone associated with the land company. On the night of October 19th, 1908, a group of masked night riders kidnapped a lawyer named Quentin Rankin, who was representing the land company. They took him to the lake and, in the darkness, ended his life. They also attempted to kill a prominent local attorney and businessman named Captain Robert Z. Taylor, though he survived the attack. The violence prompted Governor Malcolm Patterson to send in the state militia. Hundreds of troops occupied the area, martial law was declared, and mass arrests followed. Eventually, dozens of men were charged in connection with the violence. 8 were sentenced to death by hanging in what became known as the Night Rider trials. The death sentences caused a public outcry, and eventually all 8 had their sentences commuted to prison terms. The whole affair highlighted the tensions between property rights and traditional access to natural resources, a conflict that's still relevant today. The state eventually purchased the lake and made it public, which is what the Night Riders had wanted all along, though their methods of achieving that goal left several people dead and dozens in prison. And speaking of violence along borders and disputed territories, let's head southwest to Texas. Texas, the Texas Rangers' forgotten violence. Between 1910 and 1920, during a period known as La Matanza, the massacre, the Texas Rangers and local law enforcement killed hundreds, possibly thousands, of ethnic Mexicans along the Texas-Mexico border. Many of the victims were American citizens. This wasn't warfare or even law enforcement in any recognizable sense. It was systematic violence targeting an entire ethnic group, and it's a part of Texas Ranger history that took over a century to be officially acknowledged. The violence escalated after the Plan to San Diego, a revolutionary document calling for an uprising against Anglo-American authority in the Southwest, was discovered in 1915. Mexican raids across the border increased, and Texas authorities responded with indiscriminate violence against anyone of Mexican descent, whether they were involved in raids or not. Rangers and local posses would show up in predominantly Mexican communities, round up men and boys, and execute them without trial. Bodies were left hanging from trees as warnings. Entire families disappeared. One of the most documented incidents occurred at Porvenir in January of 1918. Texas Rangers and local ranchers rounded up 15 boys and men from the small village, marched them away from their homes, and shot them. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 72. None had been charged with any crime. After the killings, the remaining residents fled across the border to Mexico, and Porvenir became a ghost town. For decades, this history was buried, mentioned only in hushed conversations within Mexican-American communities who'd lost family members. The Rangers were celebrated in popular culture as heroic lawmen, their darker history conveniently forgotten. It wasn't until 2007 that a historical marker was placed at Porvenir, and not until 2021 that the Texas Rangers officially acknowledged this period of violence and the role the organization played in it. The massacre at Porvenir and the broader violence of La Matanza remain a reminder that sometimes the people charged with enforcing the law are the ones breaking it most severely. And speaking of violence justified by those in power, let's head to Utah. Utah, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. On September 11th, 1857, a wagon train of about 140 Arkansas families was traveling through Utah territory on their way to California. They never made it. At a place called Mountain Meadows, they were attacked by what appeared to be Native Americans. The travelers circled their wagons and held out for 5 days before a group of Mormon militia members approached under a white flag, promising safe passage if the travelers would surrender their weapons. The families agreed. They were marched away from their defensive position, separated into groups, and then, on a given signal, the militia members turned on them and killed everyone over the age of 7. Over 120 men, women, and older children were shot or clubbed to death. Only 17 small children were spared, and even they were distributed among Mormon families and had to be forcibly returned to relatives in Arkansas years later. For decades, The Mormon Church claimed the massacre was carried out entirely by Paiute people, with perhaps some minimal Mormon involvement. This was false. Modern historical research has conclusively shown that while some Paiutes participated, the massacre was planned and led by members of the Mormon militia, likely with the knowledge, if not the direct orders, of local church leaders. The only person ever prosecuted for the massacre was John D. Lee, a militia leader who was executed by a firing squad in 1877, 20 years after the event. He was essentially made a scapegoat while the others involved went free. The Mountain Meadows massacre occurred during a period of high tension between Mormon settlers and the federal government, when Utah was preparing for a possible military invasion. But nothing justified what happened to those travelers, families who'd been passing through and had no involvement in the Utah War or any conflict with the Mormons. So, the church didn't formally acknowledge the full extent of Mormon involvement until 1907, on the massacre's 150th anniversary. A memorial now stands at the site, and descendants of both victims and perpetrators have worked toward reconciliation. But the massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in Western and Mormon history. And speaking of policies that targeted specific groups, let's head to Vermont. Vermont, the Eugenics Survey. From 1925 to 1936, the state of Vermont conducted what it called the Vermont Eugenics Survey, a program that sounds scientific but was actually a systematic effort to identify and sterilize people the state considered undesirable. The survey particularly targeted Abenaki Native Americans, French Canadians, Chao, and people deemed feeble-minded or degenerate, which were conveniently vague terms that could mean almost anything. The survey was run by Henry Perkins, a University of Vermont zoology professor who believed he could improve Vermont's population by preventing certain groups from reproducing. His team traveled around the state, documenting families they considered problematic, creating detailed genealogies, and recommending people for forced sterilization. The Abenaki were specifically targeted because surveyors considered them racially inferior and wanted to prevent them from polluting Vermont's gene pool. Hundreds of people were sterilized under Vermont's eugenics law, many without fully understanding what was being done to them or why. Some were sterilized as teenagers. So, others were sterilized after being institutionalized for minor offenses or simply for being poor. The procedures were often performed without proper consent, and in some cases, people weren't even told they'd been sterilized until years later when they tried to have children. The impact on the Abenaki community was particularly devastating. Many Abenaki families hid their identity for generations to avoid being targeted by the survey. They stopped speaking their language, practicing their traditions, or identifying as Native American publicly. The cultural loss from this erasure is incalculable. Vermont's eugenics program continued into the 1960s, long after the Nazi regime had demonstrated exactly where such pseudoscientific racism led. The state didn't formally apologize until 2011, and efforts to provide compensation or recognition to victims and their descendants are ongoing. The eugenics survey serves as a reminder that terrible things can be done in the name of science when that science is built on racism and prejudice. And speaking of state policies that seem incomprehensible in hindsight, let's head south to Virginia. Virginia, massive resistance. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that school segregation was unconstitutional, Virginia's response was to close public schools entirely rather than integrate them. This policy was called massive resistance, which is somehow both an accurate and deeply ironic name for a movement dedicated to resisting progress. Starting in 1959, Prince Edward County in Virginia shut down its entire public school system for 5 years. All the public schools just closed. White students were accommodated through a system of private academies that sprang up practically overnight, funded by state tuition grants and private donations. These academies were, of course, whites only. Black students had nothing: no schools, no teachers, no classes for 5 years. Some black families sent their children to live with relatives in other states where schools were open. Some tried to organize their own makeshift schools in church basements and community centers, staffed by volunteers and desperately underfunded. But many children simply went without any education at all during those 5 years. An entire generation of black children in Prince Edward County had their education interrupted or completely denied. The impact on their lives, lost opportunities, stunted careers, diminished earnings, lasted long after the schools finally reopened. Other Virginia counties also closed schools rather than integrate, though Prince Edward County's closure was the longest. The whole massive resistance movement eventually collapsed under legal challenges and economic pressure. It turns out that closing all your public schools is expensive and unpopular even among white residents who supported segregation. But by then, thousands of children had already paid the price. Virginia's massive resistance is a stark reminder that some people would rather destroy public institutions entirely than share them equally. It also demonstrates how racism harms communities broadly. Even white students in Prince Edward County suffered from having their public schools shut down, even if they had access to alternatives. And speaking of communities being destroyed over prejudice, let's head northwest to Washington. Washington, the Tacoma expulsion. On November 3rd, 1885, the city of Tacoma, Washington carried out what can only be described as ethnic cleansing. White residents, including the mayor and other city officials, rounded up the entire Chinese population of Tacoma, between 200 and 300 people, marched them to the railroad station in the rain, and forced them onto trains heading south. Their homes were then burned to ensure they couldn't return. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. It was a planned, organized expulsion carried out in broad daylight with the participation of city leaders. The Chinese community in Tacoma had been there for years, running businesses, working in various trades, contributing to the city's economy. But anti-Chinese sentiment was running high across the West Coast in the 1880s, driven by economic anxiety and racism. White workers blamed Chinese immigrants for low wages and job competition, even though the real issue was employers using immigrant labor to undercut all workers. The Knights of Labor and other groups organized boycotts of Chinese businesses and pushed for expulsion. The Tacoma expulsion was part of a broader pattern. Similar expulsions occurred in Seattle, Olympia, and dozens of other Western cities during this period. Chinese residents were driven out of communities across Washington, Oregon, and California, often with violence. The Tacoma expulsion was particularly notable because the city actually celebrated it for decades afterward. For years, November 3rd was unofficially known as Tacoma Method Day, commemorating the successful removal of the Chinese population. Newspapers praised the expulsion. The mayor who'd helped organize it remained a respected figure in the community. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Tacoma began to acknowledge this history as shameful rather than triumphant. In 1993, the city formally expressed regret. In recent years, there have been efforts to preserve the history of Tacoma's Chinese community and acknowledge the injustice of the expulsion. But for over a century, the city's founding narrative included the ethnic cleansing of an entire population as something to be proud of. And speaking of violence justified in the name of economic interests, let's head to West Virginia. West Virginia, the Battle of Blair Mountain. In late August of 1921, 10,000 coal miners marched through the mountains of southern West Virginia, armed with rifles and heading toward Logan County. They were met by an equally armed force of sheriff's deputies, coal company guards, and volunteers defending the anti-union mining operations. What followed was the largest armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. The Battle of Blair Mountain lasted 5 days and involved somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 armed participants on both sides. It was, by any definition, a small war. The miners were fighting for the right to unionize. Coal companies in southern West Virginia had resisted unionization violently for years, using private security forces to intimidate workers, evict union supporters from company housing, and sometimes kill organizers. Miners lived in company towns, shopped at company stores, and were paid in company scrip that couldn't be used elsewhere. It was wage slavery in everything but name. These mining camps were isolated by design, surrounded by steep mountains, and controlled entirely by the companies. If you spoke out, you lost your job, your home, and any chance of working in the region again. If you tried to leave, company guards sometimes stopped you at the county line. Union organizers who ventured into these areas often disappeared or were found beaten on the roadsides. The tension had been building for over a decade, through strike after failed strike, through broken promises and violent reprisals. The March on Logan County was a last resort after years of failed negotiations and escalating violence. The miners were stopped by armed defenders at Blair Mountain and shooting broke out. For 5 days, the two sides exchanged gunfire across the mountainside. You could hear the gunfire echoing through the hollows for miles. The battle only ended when federal troops arrived with artillery and even some military aircraft. Yes, the U.S. government deployed bombers against American coal miners. The planes dropped bombs and tear gas. Some accounts suggest they also dropped leftover bombs from World War I. The miners dispersed rather than fight federal troops. In the aftermath, for nearly 1,000 miners were indicted for murder, conspiracy, and treason. Most charges were eventually dropped, but the Union movement in southern West Virginia was crushed for years. The Battle of Blair Mountain demonstrated how far both sides were willing to go. Miners willing to wage war for the right to organize, and companies and government willing to use military force to stop them. And speaking of government actions with long-lasting consequences, let's head to Wisconsin. Wisconsin, the Menominee Termination. In 1961, the federal government decided that the Menominee tribe of Wisconsin no longer needed to be a tribe. Through the Termination Act, Congress ended the Menominees' federal recognition, dissolved their reservation, and converted their land into a county, Menominee County, Wisconsin. This wasn't done with malicious intent, at least not on paper. The policy was sold as a way to help Native Americans assimilate and become full citizens, to free them from federal supervision and treat them like everyone else. In practice, it was a disaster. The Menominee went from being a sovereign nation with treaty rights and federal support to being the poorest county in Wisconsin almost overnight. Their hospital closed, their schools struggled. The sawmill that had been the economic heart of the community faced financial difficulties. Services that had been provided by the federal government disappeared, and the new county lacked the tax base to replace them. Poverty rates soared. The tribe's land, which had been held in trust, became subject to property taxes that many couldn't afford to pay. Parcels were sold off to pay taxes, fragmenting the tribal land base. The Menominee also lost their hunting and fishing rights, which had been guaranteed by treaty. For a tribe whose culture and economy had been built around sustainable forestry and traditional practices, this was culturally devastating. The Menominee fought back. Led by activists like Ada Deer, they organized a grassroots campaign to reverse the termination. They lobbied Congress, held demonstrations, and refused to accept that their tribe could simply be legislated out of existence. In 1973, Congress passed the Menominee Restoration Act, returning the tribe's federal recognition and many of their rights. But the damage from those 12 years of termination took decades to repair. Land that had been sold was gone forever. A generation had grown up without the services and support the reservation had provided. The Menominee termination was part of a broader federal policy in the 1950s and 60s that targeted over 100 tribes. Most, like the Menominee, eventually regained recognition, but the policy demonstrated how quickly the stroke of a pen in Washington could devastate communities hundreds of miles away. And speaking of devastating communities, let's head to our final state, Wyoming. Wyoming, the Rock Springs Massacre. On September 2nd, 1885, white miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming attacked Chinese immigrant workers, killing at least 28 people, wounding 15, and burning 75 Chinese homes. The massacre was one of the worst episodes of anti-Chinese violence in American history. Tourists swore, and like so many of these stories, no one was ever held accountable. Rock Springs was a coal mining town, and the Union Pacific Coal Company employed both white and Chinese workers, often playing them against each other to keep wages low. White miners, many of them members of the Knights of Labor, resented the Chinese workers and blamed them for low wages, even though the real issue was the company's labor practices. Tensions had been building for months. On that September day, a fight broke out between white and Chinese miners over access to a particularly good section of the mine. The fight escalated rapidly. White miners left their work areas, armed themselves, and began a coordinated attack on Rock Springs Chinatown. They burned homes, some with people still inside. They shot Chinese workers who tried to flee. The massacre lasted for hours. When it was over, the Chinese community in Rock Springs was destroyed. Survivors fled to nearby towns or hid in the surrounding area. Federal troops eventually arrived and restored order, allowing Chinese workers to return under military protection. But the damage was done. A grand jury was convened to investigate the massacre. They heard testimony from survivors and witnesses, and then they issued a report that somehow blamed the Chinese workers for the violence, claiming their presence had created the conditions that led to the attack. No one was indicted. No one stood trial. The white miners who'd participated in the killing returned to work. The Union Pacific Railroad, which owned the mines and the town, expressed regret but took no action against the perpetrators. The Rock Springs Massacre, like so many others we visited on this quiet tour, stands as a reminder of how violence can erupt when economic anxiety meets prejudice, and how justice can be denied when those in power decide some lives matter less than others. And there you have it. 50 states, 50 secrets, and a whole lot of history that somehow didn't make it into the elementary school curriculum. We've seen massacres called riots, atrocities covered up for generations, and communities erased from maps and memory alike. We've watched governments experiment on their own citizens, corporations value profits over human lives, and entire populations targeted for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But here's the thing worth remembering as you drift off to sleep. These stories eventually came to light. People fought to have them acknowledged. Historians dug them up, descendants demanded recognition, and slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. History isn't just what happened, it's also about who gets to tell the story and when we're finally ready to listen. So tonight, as you fall asleep, maybe take a moment to appreciate that we live in a time where these stories can be told, where acknowledgement is possible, even if it comes far too late. Sweet dreams, and remember, the past is always more complicated than the monuments suggest. If you enjoyed tonight's tour, go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from.